So this is lecture 8 in John, Contemplative Theologian. I'll entitle it Shepherd of Being. I want to start briefly with the book, which was turned movie, and if anyone is interested in following it, it's Thomas Hardy's great work. It was his last work before he turned to more of a tragic dimension. It's Far from the Madding Crowd. In Far from the Madding Crowd, there's a variety of key protagonists, antagonists, but Bathsheba, of course, as soon as you hear of Bathsheba, in this case Bathsheba Everdeen, you're back into a biblical story of Bathsheba and David and frayed desires. And so what voice you're going to listen to, which is very important obviously for John 10 and Shepherd of Being, what does the sheep listen to? Who does the sheep listen to? What does the flock listen to in terms of the shepherd that can be trusted or not? So Bathsheba Everdeen is, in that sense, initially the main protagonist in Far from the Madding Crowd. Interesting, Far from the Madding Crowd, you're getting away what seems to be the madding crowd, but there's always the madding crowd internally that has to be dealt with. And she has three options in terms of how to direct her desire, direct her longing for meaning, for purpose, for fulfillment. There is Gabriel Oak, who is a shepherd, cares for the sheep, and he proposes to Bathsheba Everdeen initially, but she does not see the good in this shepherd of being. Gabriel, of course, angel, oak, something solid like an oak tree. He's a shepherd who cares for the sheep. You have three metaphors at work, what Hardy's dealing with. So the Bathsheba is very much the person who is frayed or fragmented in her desires for meaning. She's pulled in all directions. Initially courted by Gabriel Oak, the shepherd, but rejects him, turns against him. The other is the lower level of Troy, who's very much a person of erratic desires, unpredictable impulses, military person, charismatic, energetic. Troy, of course, we're right into battle. Troy. Hardy knew what he was doing, and so there's a certain temperament that someone can be drawn to for meaning, who's exciting, who's charismatic, who's erratic at times, but takes a person on adventures that seems to lead to meaning, to purpose, but at the end of the day, they will betray a person. And so Troy, Bathsheba, as she turns to Troy, naively, innocently so, not wisely so, indiscriminately so, in her longing for meaning, for unity, for a meaningful relationship. After the initial courtship in the blue sky, and he woos and weds and beds her, as it were, and they get married, he discovers that he's very manipulative. He begins to take advantage of her wealth, of her inheritance. He begins to take advantage of her in a variety of ways, and she discovers, is this where I should be directing my longings, desires, hopes for meaning? And what happens when I indulge that desire indiscriminately with a Troy? And so in that sense, Hardy is exploring what shepherd is a person going to turn to for meaning. The other is the very successful businessman who's sort of your bourgeois, has the good estates, has been materially successful. He's more predictable. He offers affluence, plenty, prosperity for Bathsheba. And the question she has to ask herself is that the shepherd she's going to turn to for meaning, for purpose? Because he's the counter to Troy. One is erratic, unpredictable, charismatic, titillating in some ways, but in the long run, disappointing as a human being. The Troy figure, who can't hold anything over a long period of time because he himself has not dealt with his demons, his black dogs in that sense, his pains, his hurts, his disappointments. And then he sucks people into his black hole of his own empty personality and Everdeen, Bathsheba gets drawn into that initially, and it's a fight for her life to get out of that black hole of a person who's deeply empty themselves, and they devour others to fulfill their own emptiness. The other, as I mentioned, is the person who's very much the Lockean bourgeois person who offers prosperity, wealth, predictability, the big house. But is that the shepherd she wants to turn to for meaning? And after initially flirting with him a little bit and upping his hopes and dreams, and proposing to her, she has to turn him down because she knows he's just, in one sense, the flip side of Troy. One is security to the point of being flaccid and boring and predictable, but no life, even though predictability and security and wealth and affluence. The other is all excitement, all swollen appetite, going from one titillating, amusing things to another. But that, at the end of the day, leaves Bathsheba empty. And so her third choice, finally, by the end of the book, is she returns to the shepherd of her being, Gabriel Oak, he's there constantly in her life. When each of the relationships falter, fail, he's there to warn her, interesting enough, again and again, be wary of going down this path, be wary of Troy, be wary of going into this relationship, of buying into this situation. And so he becomes, in that sense, her shepherd of being, and it's only at the end of Far From the Madding Crowd that we get Bathsheba Everdeen coming to see that Gabriel Oak is the shepherd of her being. Now, John 10, I've wandered a little bit here, John 10, but John 10 is very much the image of the shepherd. And Jesus again and again comes back to the image of the shepherd, the sheepfold, the flock. And what the questions that is being raised in John 10 is, and of course Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice. We get our word, well, in English we get polyphonic, or phonos is voice. And so in our culture there are many voices. So what voice are we listening to for meaning? Who do we hear? Jesus talks about there are thieves, there are robbers, there are wolves, there are many voices, and we live in a polyphonic or a multivarious world, many truths, many voices, a polyphonic world in that way. So what Jesus is looking at here is as the shepherd of being. In John 10 is very, very much drawing from Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. The question that underlies all of this is what voice, what shepherd are we listening to, and why? Who, as we metaphorically, as the Bathsheba Everdeens, for we are all Bathsheba Everdeens in that sense, listening to different voices, often not discerning what is the voice worth listening to, then the consequences we have to live with because we have followed hirelings, as it were, taken in by wolves at times if we're not careful, or thieves and robbers, as Jesus will say. So what Jesus is trying to do in John 10, he's trying to articulate the nature of the true shepherd of being versus the counterfeit shepherds, those who come across as shepherds of being, but in fact are playing at the game of shepherd of being. But in the long run, naive people like Bathsheba Everdeen turn to the wrong spiritual directors, philosophical persons, political ideas, and then they miss the true understanding of what our being is meant to be, and how the true shepherd of being calls us into the sheepfold, or the true community of life itself, for the sheepfold is really metaphorically about the communities we inhabit that make for a full, knit together, meaningful life. Now, of course, the claims Jesus is making as being the shepherd of being are contested. Again, we see the Pharisees, as I've talked earlier, and the claims Jesus is making. We're back to always the issue of the claims Jesus is making, and then those who differ with the claims he is making. And it's interesting how near the end of John 10, he seems to be on the one hand making a claim, or he is making the claim as John articulates it, that he and the Father are one, which means he is God, which deeply offends the Jewish establishment. And yet he uses certain verse from the Psalter itself where it says, I say you are all gods, so what's the problem here? So interesting how Jesus is working on certain texts from the Hebrew canon that many would have ignored, but he brings them to the fore, and then he moves the discussion forward. The question of shepherd of being inevitably takes us, of course, into the issue of interfaith issues, because founders of all religions, whether prophets in religions, whether sages in religions, whether messianic figures, I just noticed, of course, anyone who's picked up what the new movie coming out in December, I don't know if any of you have read the books earlier or seen the earlier versions of it, of Dune. Of course, the Dune story is about the Fremen and the belief a Messiah will come to save them, in this case against the Harkonnens and the House of Atreides, things like that. And so, inevitably, people like Bathsheba Everdeen, there is this longing for meaning, for purpose, but everything hinges on where a person turns for that. Who's the messianic figure that a person trusts in? Who's the guru? Who's the sage? Who's the one who promises to deliver the goods, but are they counterfeits, or are they the real, genuine, or authentic, and authentikos in that Greek sense of genuine in what they're up to? And what Jesus is articulating, contra, in this case, the Pharisees and others, is that he is the true shepherd of being, of which each of us as Bathsheba Everdeens are always in the search for some meaning or purpose, or Victor Frankl will call it logotherapy. We're always in the quest to discover what will take us to the depths, to lead what T.S. Eliot calls, find that still point in the moving world. And so John 10, and of course the second part of John 10, John 10b, is about Jesus going to the festival of dedication, which again, you can move beyond the literal element of the dedication to each person can ask themselves, where and who am I dedicated to for meaning? And where and who I am dedicated, does that actually deliver the goods throughout the length of the human journey? So the question of a Bathsheba Everdeen, which Hardy postulates, in many sense we all are Bathsheba Everdeens in our journey, and then the options before us that we can turn to, from anything from the lower level Troy to the middle class bourgeois person to the Gabriel Oak. But then the question always is, how do we know the difference between a legitimate Gabriel Oak, which brings together the angelic April, with the earth oak, the deep roots? So Gabriel Oak always holds together two metaphors: Gabriel, the eternity, the vertical; the oak, the earth. So how do we hold together a deep rooting in the history of the human journey in its quest for true shepherd of being, while also being open to the vertical of the divine within time itself, and then the metaphor of the shepherd. And what are those? Because Far from the Madding Crowd opens with a young dog who's supposed to care for the sheep, but because the young dog does not have the experience and expertise of the old dog, it in fact during the night what it does, it leads the sheep over a cliff's edge, and all the sheep are killed. And so both the shepherd and the dog which historically is about faithfulness and loyalty in Western tradition, what happens when shepherds and dogs are in fact counterfeit or inexperienced in taking care of the sheep, bringing them all together, keeping them in the sheepfold so that wolves will not get at them. And so John 10 is a very significant chapter in raising the questions of, one hence using the Thomas Hardy far from the madding crowd is that we are all, just as in the previous chapter, we all have tendencies. We are born blind, and what does it mean to be sent from our blindness? Or we can all build our little houses of stone, and then we stone others who disagree with us. John 10 raises the question of what shepherds or what ideas or what people are we willing to listen to in the quest for meaning itself. And even at the highest levels of people who claim to be shepherds of being, how do we evaluate them and know for sure that in fact they are gold and can be trusted over the long haul? And Jesus posits, in fact, that he, above all, is the true and the ultimate shepherd of being. And then, of course, one of the criteria he articulates of that, amongst many other criteria, beyond words and deeds, is he, in fact, as any shepherd will, are willing to lay down their life for the sheep. And so if they don't, you can always tell a true shepherd, they're willing to serve others, and they're willing to, in fact, die to protect the sheep against, in this case, hirelings and wolves and others. So he is offering a criteria by which a genuine shepherd, so even if one does not accept the interpretation of he and God are one, which is quite a claim for anyone to make, one mark as it works itself out is that he is willing to sacrifice, which we'll pick up, of course, as we move further in the book of John, willing to lay down his life to protect the sheep against wolves and hirelings and others, so that the community is protected. We all know, of course, sheep. I was once asked to work as a shepherd when I had been teaching mountain survival in the Crow's Nest area for a while, and it was always a few months off when things slowed down. And of course, that area, southern BC, southern Alberta, has large areas where there are sheep, and caring for sheep as a shepherd and knowing how to be with them. But sheep, like Bathsheba Everdeen, in that sense, can be quite erratic. They can go all over the place. They're very unpredictable in terms of what they do. They'll often follow one sheep or others into very precarious areas. They're often naive. They'll often head off in directions which actually are dangerous for themselves and others. They don't realize it. And so there's often a naiveness, an erratic element of sheep, which obviously in the far from madding crowd element embodies that Bathsheba Everdeen, constantly going in a variety of directions in the quest for meaning. And so the question of the shepherd of being, what the question gets raised here is, who are the shepherds that can be trusted, and how can a sheep, Jesus says, they know my voice. Again, of the many voices that come our way, just as actually three metaphors are raised in John 10, the dedication. Okay, so what does it mean? What are we dedicated to? Is it just dedication to a ritual, to an event, to the temple, or is it dedicated to something much deeper and meaningful? Who's the shepherd we listen to? What's the voices we listen to in a polyphonic culture, multivarious, many claiming many truths, but what are the ones that actually lead to the bringing together of community, the shepherd that gives the life for the sheep? Jesus also mentions in this that as a shepherd of being, he's bringing eternal life. And of course, sometimes we hear the word eternal life and we think, well, that's what happens after life. Eternal life in Greek sense here does not mean what a person lives into when they cross the river, but it's a quality of existence that is can be embodied at an initial level or seed form, thrown into the soil of time and lived forth in the present tense. And so not to equate eternal life with what happens after death, but Jesus is arguing as a shepherd of being, he's going to give a quality of life to the people, in this case the people of God, in the present tense, that raises them up to the eternal status. So just as in Christian theology, God became human so humans could be divinized, so within Christianity you get this eternal life or divinization already at work within people if they've truly understand what the message of Jesus is about. It's not just a moral formula, but it's about actually a totally different ontology, if I can put it that way, a totally different understanding of being itself, which Jesus comes to give, and he used the word eternal life. So John 10 is really the question of shepherd of being. If I can just sum up, then you get the Bathsheba. Various options people can choose to look at. Some lead to life, meaningful, but not eternal life in terms of a quality of life. They lead to a franticness of life, a restlessness, a flailing about all over the place for meaning or purpose, rather than a centered turning to that which gives life, or eternal life in that sense. And underneath the metaphors in John 10 is the festival of dedication. So beyond the festival, the metaphor of the festival, what are we dedicated to? Bob Dylan, famous saying is, you've got to serve somebody. And so we always dedicate ourselves consciously or subconsciously to something for meaning, and that can change over time, but it can really be the same thing if it's just one finite thing after another, rather than being open to something much grander and bigger. So what are we dedicated to? What are the voices we listen to? What are the voices we shouldn't listen to that cause ourselves or others hurt and harm in the long run? And then what is the criteria for understanding a genuine shepherd of being? And so Jesus is articulating this in John 10. And of course, one criteria amongst many others that we've looked at through the book of John is the true shepherd is willing to lay themselves down so that the sheep will in fact prosper, do well, be protected both from hirelings and wolves and many others. And they're there for the flock of sheep, and they will actually go out into dangerous areas so that the sheep themselves will not be victims. And they're also not only victims of the wolves that threatens from without, but people who claim to take care of the sheep from within, but don't do that also. And there's many people like that who claim to take care of people, be there for them, but when push comes to shove and difficulties emerge, they disappear very, very quickly when the hard issue comes their way. So John 10, shepherd of being, and then what Jesus is working on at various levels in John 10.